Welcome to Strategy Speaks, the official podcast of the Centre for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I'm your host, Daniel Fiott, and for this third episode, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Rory Medcalf for a discussion on the Indo-Pacific and Europe-Australia cooperation. Rory is the head of the National Security College at the Australian National University, and he has a wealth of experience when it comes to issues such as diplomacy, intelligence analysis, and also, I think more importantly for our discussions today, a wealth of expertise on China and security in the Indo-Pacific. So thanks for being with us today, Rory. It's a great pleasure. And let me begin by asking you a first question, if possible, because we had the pleasure actually of welcoming you in Brussels, but that was part of a study tour that you made to Europe, where you traveled not only through Brussels, but also through London and Paris. And then afterwards, to keep up with your jet set life, you then went from Europe immediately to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. And I guess my first question to you is, first of all, what are your impressions of how seriously or not you think Europeans are taking the China challenge?
Daniel, thank you so much for including me in this important program and this important podcast. And yeah, look, it is really good to reconnect on shared strategic challenges that Australia and Europe face in the Indo-Pacific and globally, and China's a big part of that. My visit, I think it was the second half of May that I found myself back in Europe, and I'm hoping in this conversation we can include Britain as Europe. So London, Paris, Brussels. That was a useful, if you like, set of reality checks for me, because each year in recent years I've tried to spend a few weeks in Europe in a variety of countries trying to get a sense of how European partners are coming to terms with very similar strategic risks to those Australia's facing. And a lot of that is to do with the changing global power balance, a lot of it to do with the rise of assertive and indeed, in the case of Russia, outrightly aggressive authoritarian power, and a lot to do with the question of, can we build solidarity among liberal democracies despite geography? So London, Paris, Brussels this time, but in recent years I've spent quite some time in Germany, for example, in the Nordic countries as well, and so I've got a reasonable picture that I'm forming. The short answer is that we have seen a very significant shift towards taking strategic risk very seriously in the Indo-Pacific in Europe, and taking seriously the risks that that confrontation and potentially conflict in the Indo-Pacific would pose for European security interests. Of course, all that is against the much more pressing threat from the conflict in Ukraine, from Russia's aggression. So all round, I guess I have seen something of a wake-up call. Australia's been through its own wake-up call, which we can go to in a few moments, perhaps particularly on China. Having said that, on this occasion, I did sense some, I guess, unevenness in the European security response, particularly to the China challenge. Look, despite the obvious messiness of British politics, if I can understate it by simply saying it's messy, I guess the strategic direction in the UK is now pretty clear, and I think that's going to remain quite clear under the highly likely the Labor government that we'll probably see in London by the time this podcast is released. So I found the strategic conversation in London on the China challenge actually quite forthright. In Paris, reasonably so, although there was quite a lot of awkward explaining of President Macron's relatively recent summit in France with Xi Jinping, and the mixed messages that has been sending to us in this part of the world. Nonetheless, a signal that France also sees China as a profound source of strategic risk. And again, by the time this recording is out, we may see a very different French Parliament. But then finally in Brussels, I guess I found that the de-risking conversation in the European Union, while that's advanced very well in recent years, has also been somewhat sidelined by other strategic concerns. Obviously, Russia and Ukraine foremost, but also now the impact of the Middle East crisis, Gaza. There's a sense I felt that there's a lot of attention being paid to an attempt to engage with the global south, understandably. And I did feel that at, for example, the European Union Schuman Forum on security that I attended in late May, the need to engage with the global south actually, to some extent, overshadowed the China challenge. And I guess my view is that we can and should be addressing these at the same time. It's not either or. So that's my short, long answer. Finally, Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore early June. That, of course, is now an annual barometer of the strategic climate here in the Indo-Pacific. And perhaps in contrast to the messages I was seeing in Brussels, the European engagement at Shangri-La was strong, and a very strong set of messages about the unity of the theatres between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The fact that President Zelensky himself attended in person and gave a very galvanising speech was helpful. But nonetheless, Europe and the other liberal democracies are going to have their work cut out for them in a climate where there's so much uncertainty and where our authoritarian competitors really continue to prosecute their interests.
Thanks, Rory, for that overview. And it's always a pleasure actually having you in Europe whenever you can spare the time, not least because it gives us Europeans a bit of a window or an insight with one of Australia's leading thinkers on this as well. I was also struck by the way you framed the different perspectives in Europe around risk. And I took some encouragement as well from the fact that although there are maybe mixed approaches to the China challenge in Europe, that also you think or you've detected that there is more of a unifying message as well on the risks that entails as well. So I think that was an excellent way to begin our discussion. And another question that I'd like to pose to you, following on from what you've just said, and probably that's actually a word of credit to Australian diplomacy as well over the last few years, but is actually the kind of deepening of diplomatic relations between Europe, principally through the EU as an institution, and Australia as well. And there has been a willingness, I think, on both sides to unpack and also address what it is as a joint approach, what a joint approach to the Indo-Pacific could look like in particular. So I guess my first question is, where do you see further scope for Europe and Australia to cooperate on the Indo-Pacific? And secondly, whether or not you think both Europe and Australia are actually up to the challenge of meeting this more ambitious agenda?
Well, look, to begin with, there has been progress. Again, if you wind back about 5 or 6 years or more, really, I'm thinking 2018, 2019, when the European strategic conversation on the Indo-Pacific really got started, when Australia was playing a very activist role in promoting the concept of the Indo-Pacific, the idea of a unified two-ocean system of connectivity and contestation that makes what happens in maritime Asia of global significance, and that helps explain why Europe constitutes a set of stakeholders here in the Indo-Pacific. If I see the progress since then, it has been very significant. I do think Australian diplomatic activism had something to do with that, along with other friends, for example, the Japanese. Are we up to the challenge on both sides? And what more can we do together? They're intimately connected questions. We have to be up to the challenges. Is the first part of that answer. We have to identify the ways in which, with finite capabilities and with different strategic and economic profiles, Australia and other Indo-Pacific partners, think, for example, of the Indo-Pacific Four that NATO engages, Australia, Japan, Republic of Korea, and New Zealand, on the one hand, and European partners on the other, what are the strengths we each bring to that relationship? What are the areas where we can, in some ways, transcend or leapfrog geography to support one another? It's not all about military deployment, for example. I think it's a myth to imagine that simply expecting a very large and substantial European military engagement in the Indo-Pacific is going to be the answer to our strategic problems here. Notwithstanding that I know, that there's a case to say that Europe can have some serious military effects in this region if it chooses to. But for me, a lot of the action is in other dimensions. So the geoeconomic dimension, the fact that as a partner here in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's European powers individually, particularly some of the larger powers, whether it's European institutions collectively, Europe is actually still a deep stakeholder and an influential player here. If you look at the aggregate of investment, the aggregate of technology transfer and tech connectivity with this region, the potential through development assistance and infrastructure building for Europe to help provide alternatives to China when it comes to the development needs of countries in Southeast Asia or South Asia or the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. There's lots we can or should do together, and that is putting aside activism through multilateral fora, support of a rules-based order, the rule of law, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and so on. In security, in a more, if you like, in a harder sense, not just military, but also, for example, in cyber, there are realms where we need to be building global coalitions to help discourage adventurism and reinforce stability here in the Indo-Pacific. And finally, through actually protecting ourselves, and that's where the Australian experience, I think, was really quite illustrative, protecting our own countries from political interference and influence campaigns, disinformation, various forms of potential sabotage that could occur through whether it's through Chinese state-based actors or coordination with Russia and potentially with others. By protecting our own democratic systems, Australia and other Indo-Pacific democracies and European partners are adding to the global aggregate resilience and weight of the liberal democratic world, which is under siege, which is under strain. So it's very good, I think, from an Australian perspective, to see that in the last 5 to 7 years, Europe has become very serious about risk, very serious about the China factor, not in a full decoupling sense, and I don't think anyone in Australia is seriously expecting that. Australia itself, of course, has its own very substantial trade relationship with China still, and its own areas of vulnerability and risk. But we all have our eyes open now, I think, is the key message. There's still work to be done. There's still work to be done in Australia as well. If I'm to be mildly critical of the Australian trajectory on this, in some ways Australia's own activism has become more cautious, has slowed down. Some of that is understandable. We had a phase of intense economic and diplomatic confrontation with China in recent years, and the policy of the present Australian government is to stabilise that relationship while preserving our national security settings, like protecting critical infrastructure, like countering foreign interference, like building our alliance relationships. So Australia's probably making less noise in Europe, I suspect, than we were 5 or 6 years ago about the China challenge, but we remain profoundly like-minded with Europe, and we need to find ways to translate that into concrete action, including in the geoeconomic realm. Is Australia up to the challenge? And it's not for me in a way to say whether Europe's up to the challenge, because it has to be up to the challenge. But is Australia up to the challenge? Look, I think there are live debates still in this country where the more that we can effectively exchange ideas with our European friends about how do liberal democracies that favour open economies where possible, that respect diversity, multiculturalism, the rule of law, freedom of expression, all those things we hold dear. How do these sorts of countries protect their interests in a world where authoritarian powers are seeking to take advantage? And the lessons between Australia and Europe remain live, and we need to keep that as a dynamic conversation.
Thanks, Rory. I very much liked that impression that you gave of leapfrogging geography. And I also very much appreciated the fact that you set in context Europe and Australian cooperation, not just in the military dimension, which in and of itself is important, but I think what you did quite usefully was zoom out a bit and also really emphasize the geo-economic areas of cooperation. And also beyond that as well, I think you also touched upon issues like foreign interference. And at least from a European perspective, I would agree with what you said about cooperation becoming a bit more constructive, a bit more focused. But I also think there's still a lot more scope for Europeans to learn, not only from Australia's own national experience vis-a-vis China, but also from the IP4 nations a bit more generally. You said in your response as well that you said it wasn't for you to really speak about whether Europe was up to the challenge. So I'm going to be really unfair to you now and push you on this point and ask you the question. If we put you, Rory Medcalf, in charge of Europe, and if Europe is defined as, I don't know, the chancelleries, NATO, and also the EU, what is it that you would actually like to see most from European partners in the coming years when it comes to security in the Indo-Pacific?
Okay, so you're making me an Australian agent of influence inside Europe. Well, that's very much against my counter foreign interference instincts, but I'll play the game for the sake of the conversation. And look, vice versa, I think. We also need more awareness in the Australian system of like-mindedness with Europe, of why Europe's strategic priorities are generally very not just congruent, but actually convergent with our own. Because I think that there is still a little bit of outdated thinking on both sides when it comes to this. There's still something of a view that in Australia, in the end, what matters most is not, well, obviously what matters most for us is our region, but that somehow we can address our regional challenges without engaging the global context and without looking for our like-minded partners across the globe. And likewise, that essentially we can do some things to help Europe with its challenges, but we are going to be very limited and selective in the way that we do that. And I think, as an aside, while it's good that Australia has been an active supporter of Ukraine, has provided substantial military and financial assistance, it's still not enough, and it's still less than it could be if our objective is genuinely to help Ukraine win, to help achieve peace on Ukraine's terms. So I think, sort of thoughtful voices in the commentary out in the media and the think tank community need to keep that pressure on both sides. But as to your question, what would we like from Europe? What would I like to see from Europe for Europe's interests and for Australia's interests? Look, I think firstly, a really fundamental realization that potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and I mean particularly a Taiwan contingency, Chinese aggression, use of force to annex Taiwan, but also potential Chinese use of force in other contexts, in the South China Sea, where the coercion of the Philippines could escalate, potentially against Japan as well. There are plenty of scenarios where things could go wrong, even here in the South Pacific end of the Indo-Pacific. We're thinking of a future where China could potentially be a coercive military power. I would want to see front of mind in European chancelleries, in the not only multilaterally but in European governments, front of mind the realization that is Europe's problem too, and that in fact Europe has a role and a responsibility to help deter and prevent such conflict from occurring, and that there are economic levers to be explored very actively in advance of that. I mean, the basic message that we've heard, and I guess, it was to his credit that the German Chancellor said this, that it would not be business as usual if there were conflict across the Taiwan Strait, that it would not be business as usual if China were to initiate a conflict. That's a start. It's a small start, but we need to build on that foundation and to develop, I guess, a sense of security preparedness in Europe that prepares, I guess, instruments of economic deterrence in the event of a China-driven conflict. Not just a sanctions regime, but actually a recognition that business communities simply could not operate in the Indo-Pacific, particularly with China in the way that they have. Now, we have the same challenge here in Australia. We have a mixed record of being genuinely prepared. We're just at the beginning of thinking about what a wartime or pre-war economy in this country would look like amid many potential crises in our region. But building a unified conversation between Europe and its partners here in the Indo-Pacific on that question would not only prepare us for conflict, but could actually help deter conflict, because I think the more that China realizes that we are all ready, we are all prepared, whether we like it or not, for a world where there cannot be business as usual, the more we can add to the weight of deterrence and discouragement of Chinese aggression. And as an aside to all of that, and this is not a minor point, the more that countries like Australia and European partners can be talking about national and global resilience in ways that recognise that the United States itself has a potentially volatile future, the better.
Thanks for that, Rory. I think I'm glad I asked you the question of what it would look like if you were in charge, because I think you've really put your finger on one of the main issues now that Europeans and partners, so Europe and Australia, will have to be thinking about in the coming years. And that is to move exactly from statements about no business as usual, and even, I guess, moving past the stage of saying, let's think the unthinkable. I think a lot of this is actually thinkable, right? So the point is actually, as you said it, to prepare for different scenarios. And I very much appreciated what you said, not only about preparedness, but also the deterrence effect that can have on China as well. So I think that point, I hope, is also taken up by European governments and institutions in the coming months and years. And in your response, you also ended there by referring to potential shocks or disturbance in the United States. And I just wanted, as a final question, really to get your impression on how you see the kind of political dynamic in Europe and the US. I mean, in Europe, now we've had our elections, we've seen the results of those elections, and I think the leadership now is gearing up. So we know which personalities are going to be involved. For the US, I think things are slightly more uncertain. I think a lot of people are caught up on political debates at this stage and what the presidential campaign could look like. But I guess my question to you would be, if you look at how things are shaping up in Europe and the US, what do you think that says about the West's more general approach to China over the next few years? We've got the Washington summit coming up, which I think will be a big ceremony of congratulations for the alliance. But beyond that, how do you see the West's approach to China shaping up?
And of course, you don't need me to say this, but I would also put it in the context of the approach of the liberal democracies to the Russia challenge as well. Look, I will start this answer by reminding your listeners of the underestimated affinities that we have between Australia and Europe. So, there's a fantastic piece of research out there, updated pretty much every year, the Global Values Survey. In fact, there are academics at my university, the Australian National University, who are involved in that, along with partners all over the world. And if you start systematically looking at definitions of political values and social values and plotting those, well, Australia actually would be an island somewhere between Denmark, Sweden and Germany, basically. So although, I mean, Australia is it's a fantastic multicultural democracy. It's located very much in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the Indo-Pacific literally is our geography, just as it's our neighbour Indonesia's geography. But in terms of social and political values, Australia and Europe, particularly Northern Europe, have, I think, perhaps some of the closest affinities in the world. We're closer to Europe than we are to the United States, for example, on a lot of issues like secularism and freedom of expression. Therefore, in a world where, on the one hand, liberal democracies, and by the way, I hesitate to use the term West because that's a term that can have a sort of a mixed connotation here in Australia, and of course geographically we're not West. But liberal democracies, which we all are, need on the one hand to protect themselves from extremism within, I believe. On the other hand, they need to protect themselves from authoritarian interference and assertiveness and aggression without. And of course, some of that is now occurring within our own societies. And they need to do it in ways that don't so sort of fundamentally disfigure their own liberal democratic values and identity. It's an extraordinary task. It's an extraordinary challenge. And the United States, in terms of power, is a vital partner, ally, and often leader in that. But at the same time, the future of the United States politically poses some pretty tough questions about whether we will be betraying those values in order to save them, in a sense. So the more that other liberal democracies can do together, not just in terms of talk, but in building webs of resilience, in building dialogue and cooperation, that on alliance relations with the United States, the better. And these things hopefully can bolster one another. Therefore, when it comes to dealing with the China challenge, which is perhaps more of a geographic and geostrategic challenge here in the Indo-Pacific, but is a systems challenge globally and is a systems challenge to Europe and to liberal democratic Europe, I think we may find ourselves in a future where, let's say under a Trump administration in the United States, the more solidarity we can build among the other democracies to help moderate the way the United States goes about its competition with China, the better. Now, a further complication there is the potential for more populist governments in parts of Europe. Let's see what the various elections bring. That I think we're recording this at the beginning of July, and obviously it's election season in Europe, and there's some pretty awful uncertainty about some of that. But even so, let's see what the forces of moderate liberal democracy together across Europe with friends like Australia, Canada, which we haven't mentioned in this conversation either, building coalitions globally to protect our shared interests and values, to seek to engage the United States, perhaps even among the other liberal democracies, the more that we can exchange notes about wise alliance management, the better. But also to present a united front in protection of liberal democratic order when it comes to China's assertiveness and Russia's outright aggression. That's a very tall order, but I think that we need to take that very seriously. And I think the next few months are going to be critical in preparing for some pretty confronting futures.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's quite a sobering way to end our conversation. But I also took quite some hope from how you framed the need for liberal democracies to stand together in the tide of populism, also within our nations as well, within our democracies. And I also like the way how you linked the notion of a kind of liberal democratic solidarity between nations as part of a more general approach to alliance management across the two theaters as well, which I think actually, depending on how elections go in the US and also in Europe as well, I think, as you rightfully put it, will be absolutely vital in the coming years in trying to manage the challenge from China. So thanks for that, Rory, and thanks for your time today and for joining us for our third episode of Strategy Speaks. Thanks again. I wish you all the best of your work. And to our listeners, I look forward to welcoming you to our next episode. Thank you.